Welcome back. Today is April 7th, 2020. We are moving on to Unit 7, which is going to cover the topics of drugs, moving on to alcohol, and finally we will end this unit with toxicology, which in layman terms, that would be poisons. Today's objective is going to go on page 121, and your essential question is two parts. The first thing I'm going to be asking of you guys is to classify the types of illicit drugs and their negative effects. And the second thing I'll be looking for is can you discuss the federal penalties for possession and use of a controlled substance? So we see right away that there are some vocabulary words popping out at us. We see illicit drug, federal penalties, controlled substances. So a lot of vocabulary in this. Moving on to our agenda, you should complete your check-in sometime today. You want to make sure you guys are checking in 3 times a week. That's going to be Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. Today's agenda also will include completing EQ1. I do want you guys to complete your questions using Costa's level of comprehension to do so. Hopefully you guys are getting 3 of those questions in there, all levels. We want to make sure we are annotating using highlighters. If you don't have a highlighter, colored pencils, crayons, markers, or even those symbols I taught you guys at the beginning of the year, the circling and the underlining, will work just fine. I just need to make sure that you guys are rereading these notes. And then lastly, you guys want to summarize your notes, and you want to make sure in your summary that you are answering both of these essential questions. So essential question 1, classifying those illicit drugs, and 2, talking about the federal penalties. In terms of your pride and your T-cell, you are definitely prepared for college and career by taking an online course. You are resourceful, which I didn't highlight here, but you are resourceful. You are information literate. We're going to be looking at the federal rules of regulations for drugs. And that is actually a government document, so that'll be definitely information literate. Determined, as you guys are pushing forward to the end of the year, despite all of the pandemic going on. Effective communicators, we're using technology. Really everything on here should have been highlighted, but we're looking at life skills and, of course, learning. So let's go ahead and move on to drugs. First thing we want to talk about is what is the definition of a drug. And just kind of a basic definition is that a drug is a natural or synthetic substance. So natural means that it can definitely occur in the environment. For example, cocaine is from the cocoa plant. Marijuana obviously is a natural one. Synthetic means that it's made in a lab. So the difference between that, much like the fibers, natural then is something we find out in nature, naturally occurring without the input of man. Synthetic is going to be either altered from a natural resource or completely synthesized in the laboratory setting. They are designed to affect the user's psychology. That means their mental status, how they interpret their surroundings, their moods, perceptions. Or a drug can be used to affect the user physiologically. For example, we might have painkillers, we could have antibiotics, things like that. So those are the 2 things there, natural or synthetic. And then they are affecting the user's psychology and physiological performance. When a drug is used illegally, for example, for recreation, we say that that drug has become illicit. So we'll see that word turning up another time. And illicit, I'm going to go ahead and just spell that out for you guys really quick. So it's I L L I C I T. Kind of looks like kindergartner wrote it for you guys, but the word illicit means that it is illegal or it's forbidden by your region or your government's rules. So when you hear that word illicit drug, it pretty much means illegal. When we're looking at drugs and their effects, we want to look at what can they do to the body. And so when we look at the functions of tissues or the structure of tissues in a drug like MDMA, one thing that MDMA will do, in addition to heightened perceptions, some people will report that they are highly sensitive to things like touch, sound, vibrations, things of that nature. So that frontal lobe, that brain there is really going to be amplified. But one of the other things that it does as well is it reduces your body's ability to regulate temperature. So we're again affecting that normal function of the body to regulate to about 98.6. When that happens in an MDMA user, They will kind of go through what one would experience during a fever. The body can no longer lower the temperature of the body, and we find that we have liver damage, kidney damage, which sometimes can lead to death. So again, drugs are affecting that function, maybe not intentionally, but it's a side effect of that. They can definitely be toxic. We're going to learn towards the end of this unit that really any substance can be toxic depending on the amount taken. But within normal regulations, if the drug causes an illness, either by side effect or direct usage, or death occurs, usually through overdosing, then we would say that it has a toxicity to it, or it is a toxic substance. When used with the guidance of a healthcare provider like a doctor, they can be used medicinally to fix problems. So there are antiviral drugs out there. There's antibacterial drugs. Perhaps you've had antibiotics. If you've had an infection of some type, they're going to reduce bacterial colonies in the body. Oftentimes, drugs are abused recreationally, and that's really kind of an epidemic in the United States that's been exploding a little bit more recently, particularly with opioid addictions. A few years ago, we had 75% of males being arrested in the United States had drug-related charges. So 75, 3 out of 4 arrests. 25 to 50% of all domestic violence cases reported, depending on region, had drugs associated with them or were drug-induced. And about 81% of the Department of Child Protection Services reported that those neglect cases oftentimes had a drug parallel going on as well. So maybe the parents were using drugs or something of that nature. So it's definitely a problem in the United States, particularly with opioid addiction. And then now, of course, we've heard more about vaping, which will come up a little later in the presentation. All right. So drugs can be classified in a variety of ways. This particular graphic organizer here is going to be showing you drug classification by pharmacological usage. Is this the only classification or the only terms? Absolutely not. These are some of the basic terms, and I'm going to show you a 4 by Venn diagram in a minute that uses a word that we don't have on there. But this is going to encompass the majority of our classifications here. So not in any order. Our first one is hallucinogens. And we see here, they kind of look like colored tablets, almost like candy here. And a basic response that we're going to see in the body is they're going to change your thought process. So hallucinogens may cause exactly what they sound like. They may cause the user to hallucinate. They may cause them to perceive things that are not there. And they're going to also do mood alteration. So these are going to cause the user to be extremely elated or happy, or they can go in the opposite direction and cause depression and or anxiety. Oftentimes we see mood processes after the person is coming off of the drug. So they may have heightened or increased mood, happiness or euphoria that as the drug is wearing off quickly dips into depression or anxiety as they're trying to get that drug again. Number 2 is a stimulant. A stimulant is going to affect the central nervous system. In doing so, it's going to make the user feel better. It's going to increase energy, so the person may feel like they have this boundless amount of energy to get things done. It'll increase metabolism, so oftentimes we see people lose their appetite and lose weight when under the influence of a stimulant. It will suppress fatigue, so they don't have the desire to go to sleep. Sometimes they'll report sleeplessness up to 2 days plus. What else can we see with that? And then, of course, they're going to suppress fatigue and that appetite. Some of our stimulants examples would be something like cocaine. Cocaine is an alkaloid, which is another vocabulary we'll go over, but it's an alkaloid, which is a bitter organic compound that has a nitrogen ring base, normally found from plants, but not always. So a lot of our stimulants are going to have that natural root or that natural base drug that can be altered by cooks or by pharmaceutical companies to get the desired effect. Drug 3 has 2 names, so you can either refer to it as a narcotic or an analgesic. Narcotic oftentimes is kind of used for all illicit drugs, kind of recreationally, or colloquially. But the actual term is it's an analgesic. And what that means is that it's going to affect the central nervous system to relieve pain. And so narcotics or analgesics really are kind of taking off quite a bit in the United States. We're seeing quite a bit of a problem with opioid pain medication and opioid medication addictions, really kind of going from all reaches of life, everything from your low income to your upper income families or individuals. And then drug number 4 is a depressant, and that's going to affect the CNS, or which stands for central nervous system, to relax the user, slow down metabolism. Oftentimes, doctors will prescribe these for people who are highly anxious. They might include things like barbiturates, which is phenobarbital. They reduce anxiety. So if somebody's very, like I said earlier, very anxious, they cause the person to relax. And they can also be used as a tranquilizer. So sometimes when people can't sleep, they might ask or get a depressant. So one of the examples we have is Rofinol. The street name for Rofinol are roofies. This was more of a issue, still is an issue, but more of an issue in the late 90s to the 2000s. Roofies used to be kind of a party drug that people would, or the date rape drug that people would put into drinks to cause people to fall asleep, and then they would become sexually assaulted or abused, kidnapped, things like that. Down here we have designer drugs. So designer drugs are not actually in these classifications here. They could fall into a couple of them. Most likely they're going to fall into the analgesic range. But designer drugs are made with the intent to evade the Department of Drug Enforcement Agency. And so we see the DEA here. The Drug Enforcement Agency, their job is to actually find these drugs, regulate them and how they're usage and distributed, making sure they're not on the streets. And so what drug pushers or drug producers will do, this is not pharmaceutical companies, they're going to create these drugs with the intent that they are not on the Controlled Substances Act, so that way they don't get as stiff a penalty. So we'll talk about the Controlled Substances Act in just a minute. And then one of the other things we want to make sure is that we know is that as soon as a pharmaceutical company, a legal pharmaceutical company, creates a drug, it's going to send that drug to the FBI. The FBI will then develop a procedure for IDing that drug. So that is a requirement of all pharmaceutical companies, that they do have a backlog of all of the drugs that they have created. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but how are those drugs identified? So what does a positive ID look for that drug? This is a different type of drug type comparison. So this one is a little bit more inclusive of all the different drugs I kind of left out. We see stimulants are still here. The street name for a stimulant is oftentimes an upper. And so referring back to that initial graphic organizer, we see that it affects the central nervous system to make the person feel better and increase energy. So that is why we often refer to them as upper, because it kind of makes that person feel kind of a happy high. Antipsychotics or tranquilizers is not on the original one. Okay. I actually have the antipsychotics and the tranquilizers kind of looped more in this area here. So I didn't include it on there. But again, there's different categories depending on where you go. This one is not from your book. The one previously is from your textbook. Again, depressants shows back up, and now these are the opposite. So we see stimulants opposite of the depressant. So whereas a stimulant is going to increase energy, depressants are going to decrease that energy. They're going to cause the person to relax. So they're oftentimes called downers. Alcohol, so simple just drinking alcohol like beer is considered a legal depressant, not on the Controlled Substances Act. We have barbiturates, codeine, so a variety of different drugs that are going to show up here, opium. And so we see, though, is there any kind of hard, fast classification for these drugs? Definitely not. We see quite a bit of overlapping going on here. So we have hallucinogens and depressants that can occur together, ketamine being one of them. Ketamine actually started out as a tranquilizer for veterinarians, and then it was abused after that for some of its hallucinogenic effects, also known as Special K. So let's kind of move on there. And then again, we see some in the middle, cannabis. So cannabis and marijuana actually, you're going to find later on it's an actual Schedule 1 drug, which a lot of people find somewhat fascinating, considering that in the state of California that it has been legalized. So it does have some legal and medical uses, yet it's still on a federal level considered a Schedule 1 drug. And so let's kind of look at that crime portion. So as I said earlier, 75% of evidence collected by CSI is drug related. So definitely a problem in the United States and I'm sure worldwide. So controlled substances in the 1970s required that we create a law known as the Controlled Substances Act. And what we did with that is we regulated and categorized these drugs off of three things: penalty for possession. So now we actually have it written up in the legal system. What is the penalty for having this drug on your body? Penalty for possession will also include the amount that you have. So the certain amounts, for example, a gram used to be the one the school sites use. It's also felony charges. So if it's over a gram, depending on the drug, it would be a felony. Under a drug is intent to use on the personal self, and is usually a misdemeanor. Sale, and then where you're selling from too. So selling on a school site is going to have harsher ramifications than selling on the street, for example. And there's actually written up in there how far from a school that you need to be, which is not a suggestion. It's just a fact. And then how is the drug being used? So the Controlled Substances Act 1970, it is classifying illegal drugs based off penalty for possession, sale, and use. So we definitely want to make sure we know those. And the controlled substances, we see that in quotations if you see it in your book. That's just another way for talking about drugs that are restricted by the law. So if it has any type of legal ramification attached to it, then we call it a controlled substance. So when we go through the 5 schedules, there's 5 different schedules in the Controlled Substances Act. We're going to notice that they go from Schedules 1 through Schedule 5. Schedule 1 are the drugs that have the highest potential for abuse, and they have the highest potential for addiction. So when looking at a Schedule 1 drug, they are also going to have the highest penalty for either possessing that drug, for using that drug, or for selling that drug. Now, Schedule 1 have no current acceptable medical use in the United States. So according to that federal rule, there is no reason why this drug would be prescribed from a doctor. And the reason for that is that they are very difficult to supervise, even with medical supervision, and they often lead to addiction after one use. Some examples of a Schedule 1 drug would be heroin, LSD, marijuana, ecstasy, and then again, ecstasy known as MDMA. And then you may be looking at marijuana and thinking to yourself, but wait, you can use that one in California. So federal law and state law, so certain states can decide how a drug is being used. And now while marijuana does have some medicinal usages, there are a lot of regulations onto the type of marijuana and how that marijuana is used and dispensed. So it's still considered a Schedule 1 drug because of its highly addictive qualities. But depending on what part of the plant, so that cannabis sativa that we're looking at, that's going to determine where it appears on the schedule. And again, if you take marijuana from California to a state that does not have marijuana legalized, then you would be falling under Schedule 1 penalties. So again, you just need to be careful on where you're at with certain drugs. Schedule 2 drugs also have a high potential for abuse and have a high potential for addiction. Oftentimes, these drugs will be sister drugs to Schedule 1 drugs, but they have been altered in pharmaceutical labs to decrease some of their abuse or their addiction qualities. They're accepted medical use with severe restrictions. That means that you're definitely going to be under the care and supervision of a doctor. A lot of these drugs will lead to severe psychological or physical dependence. So that means that the body is either going to feel that they need to have the drug, or the mind is going to feel that they need to have the drug. So that's 2 different types of addiction that we'll go into in later EQs. Some examples of these drugs would be cocaine, morphine, amphetamines, including methamphetamines, PCP, and Ritalin. So some of these drugs do have some medicinal uses, or they've been transitioned out. So PCP actually used to be used by the military under surgical circumstances. Morphine is the isomer of heroin. So again, kind of a sister drug there. So some of these do either have Schedule 1 roots or very close connections to the Schedule 1. And again, they're going to have severe psychological or physical dependence and lots of restrictions attached to these. When we get into the Schedule 3 or Schedule 4 drug, we're going to see that the potential for abuse is going to decrease. So that usually means that the psychological and the physical dependence is going to decrease, one or the other or both. So you're not going to be physically and psychologically dependent on these. It might be one or the other. They do have current accepted medical uses in the United States. So that means a doctor can prescribe them, and they can do so with ease of mind, knowing that they can be regulated pretty easily. They might lead to moderate physical dependence if the user is on them for a long period of time. So a lot of times these drugs will have a do not refill prescription on that bottle, so you can't get that refill, or maybe you only have one refill on that one. They can lead to high psychological dependence. So a psychological dependence means that the user believes mentally that they need to drug in order to function. In reality, do they really need that drug? No, they just think that they do. Whereas a physical dependence is the body is actually going to go through physical withdrawals. The body has been kind of tricked into thinking that it needs it to perform certain functions. These are going to include intermediate acting barbiturates. So again, that might be something like a muscle relaxer after someone's maybe perhaps had a back injury, something like that. Anabolic steroids or ketamine. Schedule 4 drugs, again, we're going to see that potential for abuse is going to decrease slightly. They do have current accepted medical uses in the United States. They are going to lead to limited physical dependence. So the body is not going to be kind of tricked into thinking that it needs that drug in order to function. But they might have psychological dependence. So again, the person, the user themselves might believe they need the drug. And again, that the body would be okay without it. We may not see a physical withdrawal there. We definitely might see a psychological withdrawal there. And so that might just require counseling of some type. These are going to include things like stimulants. We have depressants, including Valium, Xanin, or that was Xanax a couple of years ago, Librium, phenobarbital, and Darvon. And a lot of these, again, we're going to see a little bit more of the depressants showing up in the lower schedules. And our last one is a Schedule 5 drug. So Schedule 5 drugs, still regulated by the Controlled Substances Act. They have a lower potential for abuse than the other 4. They do have current accepted medical usage. Might lead to physical dependence, most likely not. May lead to limited psychological dependence, especially in youth. And then examples of this would be like codeine found in low doses of cough syrup. Codeine actually in the United States is a Schedule 5 drug, but it's often found over the counter in Canada. So just kind of differences between countries. And then this is not, if you look over here at the over-the-counter drugs, this over-the-counter is not a controlled substance. OTC stands for over-the-counter. These are drugs that you could find on any pharmacy, Target, Walmart, the supermarket. They can be abused, and sometimes they are abused. They can be changed. They might be entry-level drugs. A lot of times younger students, kind of like that junior high group, might actually take these on just to kind of get started on them as they're kind of moving into drug usage. And so that actually concludes the different schedules. So in this one, we did talk about the 2 different categories there. We talked about the types of illicit drugs based off their pharmacological effects. And then we talked about how these drugs are regulated by the government in the Controlled Substances Act. So it's pretty simple. You will have a reading assignment on Thursday that kind of goes with these to clarify a little bit more. If you look here on page 122 of your interactive notebook, you have the option of completing the vocabulary matrix. In the vocabulary matrix, you will simply explain the word. So you can use your textbook or the notes here to go back, explain or define the word. And then you're going to put either examples or pictures here. You're going to be using pages 132 through 136 of your textbook, as well as page 169. 169 has the Controlled Substances Act in there with a little bit more detail than what I put in the notes. So if there are no questions for you guys can go on your way with either vocabulary.com. The URL for that has been posted on your Google Classroom. Or you can, of course, remind me if you guys need any help. Feel free to remind me, even if it's not on one of our meet days. You can remind me pretty much any day of the week, and if I'm busy, I just won't respond. But most of the time, I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So with that, have a good day, and I will talk to you guys later on.